In the years to come, when the Ukraine war has ended and Hollywood comes calling for material for its latest blockbuster movie, there will be plenty of tales to tell. But one story looks set to stand above all others. This tale seems almost too insane to be real, as it's a story of epic proportions. But it's all too real, and it's everything a blockbuster needs: a clear villain, heroic soldiers, and a result that leaves the audience with a huge smile on its face. This is the true story of the most impressive liberation march in the history of the Ukraine war. Hollywood, start taking notes. It all starts with a plan. In darkened rooms, and among as small a circle of operatives as possible, a plan was being formulated that would eventually become the starting point that has gone on to define the legendary Ukrainian counterattack in the southeast of the country. We already know the results of that counterattack by now, at least the ongoing results. By April 6th, 480 square kilometers of Ukraine had been liberated, and more followed in a month that left Russia staring down the barrel of its first net territory loss inside Ukraine since 2024. But all of that was to come. In the weeks and days before the counterattack was underway, everything was being kept as quiet as possible. A battalion commander named Vadim, who goes by the call sign Lighthouse, was eventually part of the operation, along with the 110th Mechanized Brigade of Ukraine, in which his battalion is stationed. Everything here was done secretly, so very few people knew about it, Vadim tells the Kyiv Independent from his command post in Zaporizhia, which is the region that Ukraine's remarkable liberation march was designed to protect. Not even Vadim, despite being a battalion commander, was let in on the big secrets from the outset. Ukraine could leave nothing to chance. The push into the south and southeast was the foundation of the country's entire strategy for dealing with Russia's spring offensive targeting Donetsk and Zaporizhia city. Failure would put Ukraine on the back foot for the entire year. But success, well, how do you think Ukraine has gotten to the point where it's now inflicting up to 35,000 casualties per month on Russia, while forcing Putin's patsies into dying in droves just to take a scant 53 square kilometers of Donetsk in April? But all of that, like the territory to be liberated, was all to come. The secretive planners considered everything. Those who would be involved in the historic counterattack weren't told about it until the last minute, as Ukraine's planners worried that even the girls back home that soldiers were chatting to could be scouring for any sort of information that could be delivered to Russia's Federal Security Service. Ukraine simply couldn't take the risk of covert agents discovering the plan before it had even been put into practice. Ole, who is the Chief of Staff of the 148th Artillery Brigade of Ukraine's Air Assault Forces, tells the Kyiv Independent that only 10 people from over 2,000 in his brigade were told of the plans, and they were only informed 2 weeks before the counterattack began. The objective became clear: retake as much of the territory that Russia had claimed in the southern region during the end of 2025 as possible. Putin had been lauding those gains, as well as making up stories about Ukraine's supposed collapse elsewhere. Pokrovsk had fallen, Russian commanders told Putin. They were lying. Similar stories were spread about Kupiansk, though a lightning counter by Ukraine that reclaimed most of the city put those stories to bed. Beyond liberating its territory for future operations, Ukraine knew that it needed its southern plans to work, because it could then poke holes in the narrative of Russian dominance that Putin was trying to create. Leverage for peace talks would be the result. And with the planning completed, preparations could be made. First on the agenda was the protection of the Ukrainian infantry units that would be pivotal to the entire plan. The counterattack was scheduled to begin in late January, and Ukraine's task ahead of that was to cripple the Russian artillery units that would rain shells down on Ukraine's infantry as they attempted to advance in the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions. Ole's brigade was given the task, and his brigade's head of reconnaissance, Ilya, tells the Kyiv Independent why their work was so important. Destroying the enemy's firepower plays a very significant role in any operation, since every enemy gun that remains operational will target our units at every stage of the mission. Ilya, along with the rest of the 148th Artillery Brigade, had a monumental task ahead of them. Beyond scoping out the Russian artillery units, they also needed to locate around 400 pieces of equipment, much of it Western-supplied artillery guns that had been deployed in the Pokrovsk sector, but then left behind as Russia made its slow and snapping advance. All of this had to be done as Russian reconnaissance drones watched for signs of Ukrainian movement. Today, both Ole and Ilya believe that Russia likely knew that something was coming, but its reconnaissance failed to recognize the full scale of Ukraine's plan. By mid-January, the 148th Artillery Brigade was officially on the hunt for Russia's artillery units. Equipment had been reclaimed as best as possible. The brigade had even managed to locate 150 pieces of Russian artillery, which is roughly enough to stock 3 entire brigades, stretched across the 30-kilometer line that ran from Hulia Pola in Zaporizhia to the Dnipropetrovsk village of Berezova. All of it had to be destroyed, and the 148th Artillery Brigade completed the task with relish, all while being mindful of Russia's reconnaissance drones. Fortunately, a thick fog blanketed Ukraine for much of the mid-January operation, though that fog could work against Ukraine, as it did towards the end of January when it grounded drones in the southwest. Russia had the same problems. Reconnaissance drones may have been able to fly, but with the fog being so dense, they struggled to locate the positions from which fire was being rained down on Russian artillery units. Little was reported about this operation, though we saw some snippets suggesting that it was underway, as well as perhaps hinting at other units that were involved in the early stages of what will become the counterattack. For instance, January 10th brought with it the news that Ukraine's 210th Separate Assault Regiment had destroyed a Russian 2S-1 Gvazdzika howitzer in the Zaporizhia region. 2 days later, footage from Ukraine's 18th Army Corps revealed that Ukrainian drone operators had taken out a camouflaged, self-propelled artillery system. Were these strikes part of the wider effort to clear Russia's artillery from the south? We may never know, and that's the entire point. What looked like scant and isolated strikes may have all been a part of something much bigger, and the fact that the media didn't seem to identify any sort of pattern, much less the Russian military, is precisely what all of Ukraine's planning had been about. Giving the game away at this point would have been a signal that something bigger was coming. But nobody caught on, and the 148th Artillery Brigade, perhaps with helping hands from other Ukrainian units, continued its work. Not everything went as smoothly as planned. Along with its own artillery, the 148th Artillery Brigade was also equipped with FPV and strike drones, which it often deployed against the Russian artillery pieces that it discovered. Sometimes a single, well-placed FPV drone was enough to wipe a piece of artillery off the map forever, and other times a dozen drones could be sent and they barely made a dent. But bit by bit, the brigade was doing what it had been tasked to do. When its drones weren't attacking artillery directly, they were homing in on Russian electronic warfare equipment to clear the way for the rockets to come. Patience and persistence are virtues. The 148th Artillery Brigade proved that with its January exploits, and in the months to come it would continue its consistent assaults, all to set the stage for Ukrainian ground pushes to come. In January, 150 Russian artillery pieces were attacked. The number was 98 in February, and then 115 in March. When soldiers from Ukraine's 110th Mechanized Brigade and its 95th Air Assault Brigade started playing their parts in the grand plan to retake as much territory as possible, they reported back that Russia's artillery units were barely operational. The ground had been made as safe from artillery as it possibly could be. Now the counterattacks against Russia's entrenched forces in the grey zones and beyond could begin. But before we go deeper into how those counterattacks changed everything for Ukraine in 2026, this is The Military Show, and we bring you the full picture, not just the headlines. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel if you want to stay ahead of the curve. Ukraine's counterattack wasn't sweeping, at least not at first. The early portions of it were conducted under the dense layer of fog that had worked to the 148th Artillery Brigade's advantage, and that was ironically giving Russia the mistaken impression that it was taking the initiative in the south. After all, it was only in November 2025 that Russian forces had been able to take advantage of the fog in Ukraine to infiltrate Ukrainian positions in Zaporizhia. Putin's patsies clearly thought they were going to be able to do the same again, even as their artillery was being destroyed around them. They were wrong, and soon the Ukrainian terror emerging from the fog would make them dead wrong. Dmytro, who led the first groups of soldiers to venture into the fog as part of his role as the deputy battalion commander with the 95th Brigade, tells the Kyiv Independent of daring raids during what he dubs the grey hours during the early stages of the counterattack. Russia's forces had no idea that Ukraine's soldiers were coming, having failed to put two and two together when it came to the attacks on their artillery. Each mission launched was preceded by reconnaissance so intensive that it even picked up on trash left behind by the occupiers, offering hints to where Russia's soldiers were. Direct fighting was never the goal for Ukraine's infantry. Instead, the drones went in first, cleared out as many Russians as possible, and were then followed by troops on the ground to sweep up the remainder. It's an approach that had already been proven effective in Ukraine's liberation of Kupiansk, as well as during operations in the Dobropilya sector. Dubbed Search and Destroy, the tactic had been honed to near perfection by the time the Ukrainian forces on the ground in Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia were using it. Time and time again, Russia's defenders and infiltrators had no answers. Even with the fog blanketing the skies, Ukraine's drones were finding them and they were being eliminated. Ukraine's 95th Brigade even took the tactic a step further. Once a position had been claimed, assault groups would sneak up to 3 kilometers deep into the grey zone beyond, creating what amounted to a barricade around the newly taken position, from which ambushes could be launched against any Russian units that attempted counterattacks of their own. Retreating soldiers were taken out along the way by these assault groups, and those left behind were able to quickly advance to join their comrades when they were given the all clear. Progress was being made. But Russia was catching on to what was happening. By early February, Russia started to intensify its own drone activity in the regions where Ukraine was making its advances. Disorganized and haphazard though it was, this impromptu drone defense was enough to start slowing down the Ukrainian advance, to the point where some days saw Ukraine push forward by a kilometer, and others were made so dangerous that Ukraine's assault groups stayed put. Then something unexpected happened, at least for Russia. What almost nobody knew, even when the operation was being planned, was that Ukraine's new defense minister Mikhailo Fedorov had been speaking to SpaceX. The topic of conversation was simple: cutting off Russia's access to the illicit Starlink terminals it had been using in Ukraine by creating a whitelist that ensured only Ukrainian terminals could be used. In early February, the next part of Ukraine's plan was put into action. Fedorov had been successful. SpaceX shut down Russia's Starlink terminals, and just like that, Russia's soldiers, who had been slowly starting to mount a defense, fell into a complete shambles of panic and miscommunication. The effect was almost immediate. In a follow-up article, the BBC reported that Russia's soldiers had lost 50% of their capacity for offense across almost the entire front line. That amounted to less of everything from assaults to drones, and it also meant that openings were being created for Ukraine's counterattacking forces in the south. Evidence of a full-blown Russian retreat was finally being reported in the Zaporizhia region, and the pace of Ukraine's advance went into overdrive. According to some sources, Ukraine managed to liberate up to 200 square kilometers of its territory during the first 5 days of the Starlink shutdown. That was roughly the same amount of Ukrainian territory that Russia had snatched in December 2025. Not only was the counterattack on, but it was gaining more ground than anybody could have expected. Ukraine would have been happy enough with the Starlink situation alone, but at around the same time that Russia's infantry and ground units were losing access to a critical communications tool, Putin was making what may go down as the dumbest decision that he has made yet. Russia's leader cracked down on Telegram in a desperate attempt to retain control over the Ukraine war narrative at home, and in doing so he hurt his soldiers even more. Even Putin's favorite mouthpiece Dmitry Peskov seemed almost incredulous as he said, "There's nothing good about it, restricting Telegram for Russia's soldiers, but the law must be followed." Ukraine must have thought that all of its Christmases had come at once. If Putin kept going in that direction, Russia would have to resort to carrier pigeons and megaphones to communicate on the front. After a February filled with chaos, Russia started to come up with some makeshift, though certainly not effective, solutions for its Starlink and Telegram woes. That allowed Russia to send more drone units to the southern regions. But again, the bit part player in the story that was emerging to be an unexpected star emerged once more. The fog came back, limiting the impact of Russia's drone-based defense. Ukraine took advantage of this by taking the risk of deploying BMP infantry fighting vehicles and even a Soviet-era T-72 tank to cart troops around in the grey zones. But that was never a long-term strategy. Once the fog cleared, those vehicles would become easy targets for the Russian drones that were arriving at the scene. Still, by the end of March, the results were already in. The remarkable counterattack, which was started with hushed discussions and evolved into one of the single most impressive feats that Ukraine has pulled off against Russia so far, has liberated hundreds of square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. Now, as we get deeper into spring, and the fog that has played such a huge role in Ukraine's march forward has dissipated, Ukraine's task is to hold this territory for as long as possible. It's not an easy job. With bulky vehicles back out of the picture, Ukraine is sending backup to its soldiers on the new front on foot. An arduous journey that can be as long as 20 kilometers awaits those who take up the task, and it has to be conducted through grey zones that are patrolled by Russian drones. Not all of those who enter make it to the other side. The Kyiv Independent reports on the brave story of an older soldier named Volodymyr, who volunteered with Ukraine's 110th Mechanized Brigade to head back out to the front, even though he had been left with vision and hearing problems due to injuries he'd suffered 3 years before. On Volodymyr marched, to the point where he felt that he was holding back his comrades. He told his brothers in arms to leave him behind or shoot him. That isn't the Ukrainian way, it's the Russian way, and Volodymyr's comrades made that clear by refusing to abandon him. Unfortunately, not all of Volodymyr's group made it. One night, as the older soldier suffered from a high fever, his 2 comrades pushed forward. Only one came back, the other having been killed by an FPV drone. Still, Volodymyr marched as fast as he could alongside his remaining comrade. A drone attack stopped him in his tracks, just 100 meters from a dugout that he and his comrade Ole were heading toward. Volodymyr was left with bleeding ears and temporary vision loss. Russia followed up with more drones that dropped grenades, giving him shrapnel wounds. But he survived, spending the night under a thermal blanket just outside the dugout as Ole waited for an opportunity to bring him in. Ole tried twice and failed. The third time was the charm, and Volodymyr spent 2 weeks in the dugout recovering before making it back out. As tragic as this coda to the story of Ukraine's counterattack is, it also displays the heart and the courage of the soldiers involved. If Volodymyr were Russian, he would have been abandoned. Of that, there is no doubt. As far back as October 2023, the word was out that about 90% of Russia's combat deaths were coming as a result of non-fatal injuries that weren't being treated. Now, as Ukraine holds the territory that it's liberated, it continues to show Putin what it means to truly take care of your soldiers. As for Putin, he wants the territory that Ukraine retook back, and that was the point all along. Russia is being forced to divert resources from Donetsk and other high-profile areas in a desperate attempt to reclaim territory that Russia thought it already held. In about 2 months, Ukraine transformed the front line and regained tactical positions that it can use to stretch Russia's forces. Now the job is to hold for as long as possible, eliminating as many Russians as possible along the way. And when the year begins to reach a close and the gloomy conditions that helped to make Ukraine's dramatic counterattack possible return, Putin will know one thing. Ukraine has proven that it can carry out localized counterattacks in areas where Russia is at its weakest. It can happen again. All Ukraine needs is the right opportunity, as it now has the blueprint for future offensives. And as all of this was happening and as Ukraine still holds in the south, Putin's forces are dashing themselves against the rock that is the Donetsk fortress belt. Territorial gains are shrinking, Russian soldiers are dying in record numbers, and it's becoming ever clearer that Putin's strategy for Donetsk is failing. Find out more about that losing campaign and why it may signal another shift in the war by watching our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more stories of Ukrainian bravery and brilliance in the face of Russian aggression. And thank you as always for watching.